At 68, just 3 weeks after burying the husband she had loved for 43 years, Eleanor Mercer thought grief had already taken everything it could from her. Then a lawyer placed an unexpected deed in her hands. Thomas had secretly left her an abandoned creamery in rural Wisconsin, a crumbling brick building he had owned for 11 years without ever telling her. Her son told her to sell it before the taxes and repairs swallowed what savings she had left. And even the locals couldn't understand why a grieving widow would waste her time investigating a place everyone else considered worthless. But Nell couldn't sell the last secret her husband had left behind without seeing it for herself. So she took an old brass key from Thomas's keyring and unlocked the creamery office. Beneath years of dust, she found fresh maintenance receipts in Thomas's name, milk ledgers filled with the names of forgotten dairy families, and a handwritten message that made her wonder what her husband had really been doing there. They were never just numbers. Then, behind a heavy shelving unit, Nell noticed the outline of a doorway that had been deliberately sealed, and when she found Thomas's initials written across the plywood, she realized he had been inside that hidden room only 2 years before his death. What Thomas had protected behind that wall would eventually reveal a truth about his own family that had been buried for decades. But first, Nell had to find a way inside. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. I hope you're having a peaceful morning, afternoon, or evening wherever you are. And if you enjoy emotional stories about forgotten American families and the secrets they leave behind, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's return to Nell and the creamery her husband never wanted anyone to forget. 3 weeks after Thomas Mercer's funeral, Nell still woke expecting to hear him in the kitchen. For 43 years he had risen before her, filled the coffee maker too high, and opened the back door to judge the Wisconsin morning as if the weather required his personal approval. Now the house stayed silent. His brown work jacket remained on its hook. His gloves lay beside the basement stairs. Nell had moved neither. At 68, she had discovered that grief lived most painfully in ordinary objects. She was standing at the sink when Claire Donnelly called. The attorney said there was one item in Thomas's estate they needed to discuss. Nell drove into Haven Ridge expecting an overlooked bank account or insurance document. Instead, Claire placed a deed on the desk. "Bellwether Creamery," she said. Nell stared at the name. "What is that?" Claire hesitated. "A property outside town. Thomas was the owner." Nell looked again, certain she had misunderstood. Thomas didn't own a creamery. According to the deed he did. He inherited it 11 years ago. 11 years. Nell felt something colder than grief settle inside her. She could account for 11 years of birthdays, Christmases, doctor appointments, dinners, arguments, and quiet Sunday drives with the man she had married. Somewhere among them, Thomas had owned an entire building and never mentioned it. Claire explained that the creamery was no longer operating. Taxes had been paid, but the property would now pass to Nell. There could be maintenance costs and liability concerns. On the drive home, Nell called Daniel. Her son listened, then gave the practical answer she expected. "Sell it, Mom. You don't even know what it is. Neither do you. That's the problem." Daniel suggested Thomas might have inherited it unexpectedly and simply never found a buyer. Nell wanted that explanation to satisfy her. It didn't. Why wouldn't he tell me Daniel was quiet? Dad didn't talk about everything. That hurt because it was true. Thomas had been private, especially about his childhood, but privacy was one thing. 11 years of taxes and ownership was another. That afternoon, Nell drove 12 miles beyond Haven Ridge. Bellwether Creamery stood beyond a weed-lined gravel entrance, a 2-story red brick building with faded lettering above the loading side. Several windows had been boarded over, Grass pushed through cracked pavement. Nell stayed behind the wheel for nearly a minute. The place looked useless. Daniel was probably right. Selling it would be sensible. Yet anger rose unexpectedly beneath her sadness. "What were you doing, Thomas?" she whispered. She walked around the building carefully. Near a side entrance, she stopped. The door was weathered, its paint peeling in long strips. But the padlock hanging from the latch was not. Its metal was bright beneath a thin layer of dust. Someone had replaced it relatively recently. Nell returned to the car and emptied Thomas's keyring into her palm. She had carried it in her purse since the hospital returned his belongings. House key, truck key, workshop key. 2 she didn't recognize. Then she noticed a small brass key with a narrow paper label protected by cloudy tape. Thomas's handwriting was unmistakable. B.C. Office. Her throat tightened. She looked from the key to the Creamery. Whatever explanation Daniel wanted to believe, Thomas had known this place well enough to label its key. Now crossed the gravel again. She fitted the brass key into the newer padlock. For 1 second she almost hoped it wouldn't turn. Then she twisted it. The lock clicked open. Nell did not enter the Creamery that afternoon. The open padlock was enough to tell her Thomas had expected to return, and grief had not made her reckless enough to explore an aging industrial building alone. The next morning, she called Caleb Price, a local carpenter and restoration contractor whose number Claire had given her for a safety inspection. By 10, Caleb was standing beside Nell at the office door, studying the brickwork and sagging gutter. "We go slowly," he said. "If I tell you to stop, you stop." Inside, the air smelled of dust, old wood, and damp plaster. Their flashlight beams crossed rusted milk cans, a cream separator, and weighing equipment left beneath stained canvas. Dust softened almost everything. Almost. Caleb crouched near the office entrance. "See that?" A narrow path across the floor showed lighter footprints and disturbed dirt. It led toward a desk and several tall shelves. Someone's been moving through here more recently than the rest of this place suggests. Nell said nothing. Thomas's brass key felt heavy in her pocket. Caleb tested the floorboards before allowing her farther. Water had entered along one wall, and several shelves leaned dangerously. "If there are papers you care about, they need to get away from that moisture soon." "I don't know if I care about any of it yet." Even to Nell, the answer sounded defensive. The desk drawers held nothing but brittle invoices and pencils. On a shelf nearby, she found thick business ledgers, their cloth covers faded gray and green. Before opening one, Caleb called from behind the desk, "Mrs. Mercer." He held up a narrow receipt that had slipped beside a cabinet. The paper was clean enough to look out of place. It came from a Haven Ridge hardware store and was dated 4 months earlier. Moisture barriers, storage boxes, metal shelving, purchaser Thomas Mercer. Nell read his name twice. 4 months ago, Thomas had still been complaining about his knees and forgetting where he left his glasses. Yet he had come here and bought supplies for a building he had never once mentioned to her. She called Daniel. "Maybe he was preparing it for sale," he said after she described the receipt. "Then why buy storage boxes? To clean the place out, Mom? We don't know." "Exactly," Daniel exhaled. "Just don't turn every receipt into a message from Dad." Nell ended the call more sharply than she intended. She opened the nearest ledger, partly to occupy her hands. Columns recorded dates, pounds of milk, butterfat percentages, payments, and farm numbers. Ordinary business records from 1962. Then she noticed handwriting in the margins. Beside Farm 18 was a surname, Alvarez, Farm 27. Bellwether, Farm 41. Price, Caleb. He came over and leaned closer. Price was my grandparents' farm. His voice changed. He traced the line without touching the paper. They milked outside Haven Ridge. I knew they delivered somewhere around here, but I never saw this. Nell turned several pages. The handwritten family names continued beside numbers that otherwise meant nothing to her. Caleb pulled another ledger free, but the bottom edge was damp. These won't survive many more seasons like this. Nell looked at the shelves differently now. Thomas had bought moisture barriers and boxes. Perhaps he had seen the same damage. A folded piece of paper protruded near the spine of the 1962 ledger. Nell eased it out. 3 words were written in Thomas's familiar block lettering. They were never just numbers. For a moment, the empty office disappeared. She could see Thomas at their kitchen table making lists in that same handwriting, pressing too hard with his pen. Her anger remained, but grief moved through it so suddenly she had to grip the desk. "He wrote this?" she said. Caleb gave her time before asking, "Why would the family names matter to him?" Nell had no answer. Caleb studied the ledger again, turning one page carefully. Then his finger stopped. Mrs. Mercer, Nell followed where he pointed. Beside another old farm number, written clearly in the margin, were the words Mercer Farm, Route 6. Ruth Alvarez lived 6 miles outside Haven Ridge in a white farmhouse overlooking fields that had not held dairy cattle in years. Nell brought a photograph of the ledger page rather than risk removing the original from the Creamery. Ruth, 74, studied the image at her kitchen table through narrow reading glasses. "That's my father," she said, tapping Alvarez beside Farm 18. Not his handwriting. Margaret's. Margaret Bellwether Ruth nodded. She kept the books at the Creamery longer than anyone. Nell asked why Margaret would write family names beside numbers already assigned to farms. Ruth gave her a look suggesting the answer should have been obvious. Because Margaret knew who those numbers were. She poured coffee and described Bellwether when milk trucks still arrived before sunrise. Farmers brought more than milk. News traveled with them: a sick child, a barn fire, an engagement, a bad harvest, a cow that had kicked someone through a gate. The Creamery was business, but it was also where isolated farm families crossed paths. Margaret remembered everything. Ruth said, "Toward the end, farms started disappearing. Families sold their herds, barns came down, people moved. Margaret hated seeing their papers thrown away." "What papers?" "Photographs, letters, farm books, anything families were willing to give her. She said someday people would want to know who had been there." Nell thought of Thomas's note. They were never just numbers. Did she keep those things at Bellwether? Somewhere. I never asked where. Ruth glanced again at the photographed page. "Why are you looking into this?" Nell hesitated. Saying it aloud still felt like exposing Thomas. "My husband owned the Creamery." Ruth's eyebrows rose. "Thomas, for 11 years. I didn't know." "Neither did I." The words came out harder than Nell intended. Back at Bellwether that afternoon, Caleb had moved the dampest ledgers onto temporary dry supports. He warned Nell that the damaged wall needed attention before they handled much more. She told him what Ruth remembered. "Then these could be an index," Caleb said, looking across the shelves, names pointing to whatever Margaret saved. They began measuring the office and adjoining storeroom, not searching for anything hidden so much as determining which areas were safe. Caleb measured one exterior wall, then the corresponding interior distance. He frowned and repeated it. What Nell asked, "The numbers don't match." The storeroom should have extended several feet farther toward the rear of the building. Instead, shelving covered what appeared to be an ordinary interior wall. Caleb tapped it. Then checked the exterior measurement again. "There's space behind this." Before Nell could answer, Daniel's car pulled into the gravel lot.
He entered, looking irritated and worried in equal measure. "Mom, you hired someone for a safety inspection?" Daniel looked at the ledgers on supports, the tape measure, and the opened office. "This is becoming more than an inspection."
"We found our family name in the records. That doesn't mean Dad wanted you tearing apart an abandoned building. I'm not tearing anything apart." "Then what are you doing?" Nell heard Thomas in the silence between them, not his voice, but the absence of it. "I'm trying to understand why your father spent 11 years coming here without telling me." Daniel softened. "Maybe there isn't some bigger explanation." "Then I'll find that out." "And how much will it cost?" He gestured toward the stained ceiling. "This place could eat through your savings." Nell knew he was frightened for her, which made his argument harder to dismiss. "If I sell it tomorrow," she said quietly, "and whatever Thomas was protecting gets thrown into a dumpster, I'll never know." Daniel looked away. Nell added, "I'm afraid he died carrying something I should have understood." Her son's expression changed, but he had no answer. Caleb, who had stepped aside during their argument, called gently from the storeroom, "You both should see this." He had shifted one tall shelving unit just far enough to expose a vertical seam. Behind it was not a wall, but an old doorway covered with plywood. The screws were rusted at their edges, and the floor near the frame felt soft under Caleb's cautious pressure. "Nobody opens this today," he said. "Not until I brace that section." Nell crouched near the plywood. Faint pencil marks showed through years of grime. She wiped them gently with her sleeve. 2 letters emerged first. T.M. Beneath them was a date from 2 years earlier. Nell stared at Thomas's initials, while Daniel stood silently behind her. Whatever lay beyond the sealed doorway, Thomas had been standing exactly where she was only 2 years ago. Caleb returned the next morning with lumber, braces, and a refusal to hurry. Before touching the plywood doorway, he reinforced the weakened section of floor and checked the ceiling above it twice. Nell waited nearby with Daniel, who had come despite insisting the day before that the building should be sold. Neither of them mentioned that argument. When Caleb finally removed the first screw, it came out with a dry squeal. The others followed slowly. Together, they eased the plywood away from the frame. Nell had imagined a hidden room packed floor to ceiling with whatever Thomas had spent years protecting. Instead, the narrow space beyond was disappointingly bare. Dust lay thick over several mostly empty shelves. A few cardboard boxes remained along the back wall, along with darker rectangles where other containers had once rested. Something was stored here. Caleb said, "A lot more than what's left." Nell stepped inside carefully. The first box held photographs. Dairy farmers stood beside barns, milk trucks, children, prize cows, and weathered farmhouses. Some images had names written on the back. Others carried only dates. Caleb lifted one photograph and stopped. "That's my grandmother." In the picture, a young woman stood beside a Holstein with one hand on its neck, smiling towards someone outside the frame. Caleb sat on the edge of a reinforced board and studied it. "I've never seen her this young." Nell watched his face soften. Until that moment, the Creamery had still felt like Thomas's secret. Now it seemed to belong partly to Caleb, and perhaps to every family whose name Margaret Bellwether had written beside a number. Another box contained notebooks, each labeled in careful handwriting. Margaret Bellwether's name appeared inside the front cover. Page after page listed families, farm locations, dates, and brief notes. Beside many entries were codes, A17, C4, B9. Others ended with a single word: vault. Could these matchboxes? Nell asked. Caleb looked at the nearly empty shelves. "Maybe." or wherever the missing material went. Nell found Price, Alvarez, Bellwether, then Mercer. Before she could study it, tires crunched over the gravel outside. A man in a tan work coat appeared at the office entrance and introduced himself as Martin Voss. Nell recognized the surname from local signs along the highway, but had never met him. Voss explained that he owned neighboring farmland and operated an agricultural development business. He had heard Thomas's estate had transferred Bellwether to her. "I've wanted this parcel for some time," he said, "mostly for access. Your building sits in a useful place." His manner was polite, almost apologetic. He gave Nell a written offer. The number was higher than she expected. Daniel read it over her shoulder. Voss glanced around at the damaged ceiling and stained walls. "I'm not trying to tell you what to do, Mrs. Mercer, but old industrial buildings get expensive quickly. Insurance, structural work, code issues. Sometimes keeping one costs more than anyone realizes." Nell disliked hearing Daniel's concerns repeated by a stranger, mostly because they were reasonable. "I've only had the property a few days. Of course," Voss handed her his card. "Think about it." After he left, Daniel tapped the offer. That could solve the whole problem. Nell looked toward the hidden room. "We don't know what the problem is yet. Mom, this is exactly what I mean. A building doesn't become priceless because Dad kept secrets in it." She did not answer. His words stayed with her after he left, for nearly an hour. Nell sat at the old desk examining Margaret's notebooks, while Caleb continued checking the hidden room. The codes repeated too consistently to be casual notes. Families were linked to letters and numbers, sometimes several at once. Price had 3 references. Alvarez had 2. Bellwether had many. Mercer had fewer. Nell turned back to the Mercer entry and read more carefully. Walter Mercer appeared first, followed by a farm location she recognized only from the ledger. Beneath it, Margaret had written several dates. Then one sentence stopped Nell completely. "Walter original testimony withheld at son's request." Caleb looked over when Nell whispered, "Thomas." "What?" She pointed to the line. Walter Mercer had been Thomas's father. There was no other son whose request Margaret could have meant. Nell read the words again, feeling the room change around her. Thomas had not stumbled onto these records near the end of his life. He had known enough about Margaret's collection to decide what should be withheld. The notebooks, the missing boxes, the fresh supplies, the sealed doorway. None of it had been accidental. Caleb crouched beside her. So he knew about this archive. Nell kept her eyes on Margaret's handwriting. "Long before I knew this building existed." And somewhere among the records Thomas had chosen to protect was testimony about his own father that he had asked Margaret not to show. Nell spent the next morning at her kitchen table with Thomas's financial records spread around her coffee cup. What she found was not one forgotten payment, but 11 years of deliberate care. Property taxes on Bellwether Creamery had been paid every year. So had basic insurance. There were checks for roof patching, drainage work, replacement locks, and small repairs that would have meant nothing to anyone who did not know the building. The money had come from a personal account Thomas rarely discussed because it held earnings from occasional repair jobs he did outside his regular work. None of the amounts was enormous by itself. Together, they made Nell's chest tighten. Thomas had often said they needed to be careful with money. He had postponed replacing his truck. He had complained about the price of heating oil. Yet quietly, year after year, he had kept Bellwether standing. Daniel arrived after lunch and read through the statements in silence. "Thousands," he finally said. "Over time, yes. And he never told either of us?" Nell heard more hurt than anger in his voice. "No." Daniel pushed one page away. I don't understand why a building got this much from him when he acted like every expense at home had to be justified. Maybe it wasn't the building. Then what was it? Nell looked toward Thomas's empty chair. That's what I'm trying to find out. Her phone rang before Daniel could answer. Martin Voss said he wanted to revise his offer. He was still courteous, but less casual than before. His company planned to expand grain storage on neighboring land, and Bellwether's parcel included an access strip that would make truck movement easier. He offered more money, but only if Nell could decide within several days. Planning schedules move quickly, he explained. I don't want to pressure you, but I can't leave the offer open indefinitely. After the call, Daniel said, that is not a bad offer. I know, you could sell before the roof becomes your problem. It already is my problem, you know what I mean. Nell did. That was what frightened her. Every sensible argument led toward selling, while every unanswered question pulled her back. That afternoon, Ruth met Nell at Bellwether. Caleb had left the hidden room braced and dry enough for careful work, and the two women sat at the old office desk with Margaret Bellwether's notebooks between them. Ruth adjusted her glasses and began comparing entries. A could mean photographs, Nell suggested. Maybe, Ruth said, or alphabetical shelves. They tested the idea and quickly discarded it. The codes did not match names or dates. Ruth noticed that several families had more than one letter designation, usually paired with different numbers. Categories, she said. That would make more sense. Letters for types of records, numbers for families, perhaps. They worked through a dozen entries. The pattern held. A family might appear under photographs, correspondence, account books, or other materials. Each assign a code. But one notation resisted every system. Vault. It appeared beside selected families with no number after it. That's not a category, Ruth said. Margaret wouldn't write it like the others if it were. Nell closed the notebook. Then it's a place. The word stayed with her all evening. The next morning she drove to the county records office and asked for historical plans connected to Bellwether Creamery. The clerk produced a file containing surveys, tax maps, and renovation documents dating back decades. Nell studied them at a long table under fluorescent lights until the lines blurred. One early floor plan showed the office, loading area, storage rooms, and a small refrigerated chamber used for records and temperature-sensitive materials. On a later renovation plan, that chamber no longer appeared. Nell leaned closer. According to the original measurements, the missing room sat beneath the old loading section, farther back than the hidden room Caleb had opened. In the margin beside it, someone had drawn a circle in blue ink. Nell stopped breathing for a second. Thomas had circled measurements that way for as long as she had known him, never a neat oval, always two quick overlapping strokes. Darker at the lower left where his pen pressed harder. She had seen the same marks on lumber estimates, repair diagrams, and grocery lists when he wanted her to notice a price. The blue ink was newer than the original plan. Thomas had held this paper. He had found the missing chamber. Nell took a permitted copy and drove directly to Bellwether, where Caleb was checking the floor near the loading area. She spread the plan across the desk. Look at this. He compared the drawing to the building, then walked the distance twice. Daniel, who had come to meet them, watched from the doorway. Caleb returned and placed one finger on the plan. If these measurements are right, the room should still be there. Where? Daniel asked. Caleb pointed toward the rear of the creamery. Under the old loading floor. Nell looked at Thomas's blue circle and understood that he had been searching for the same place long before her. Somewhere beneath their feet was the vault Margaret had marked again and again in her notebooks. Caleb refused to lift a single board until he had examined the loading floor from above and below every accessible edge. Years of moisture had weakened the timber, and an old renovation had covered part of the original freight access with newer flooring. "There's a void underneath," he said, tapping carefully near the section marked on the plan. "But if we rush this, we could end up inside it faster than we want." Nell waited while he braced the surrounding joists and removed the newer boards one at a time. Daniel carried debris outside. By midday, Caleb uncovered the outline of a rectangular hatch. Beneath it, a short concrete stairway descended into darkness. Nell switched on her flashlight. At the bottom stood a steel door. The sight of it produced no triumph, only another tightening in her chest. Thomas had known this was here. She climbed down after Caleb tested the steps. The door had a combination lock built into its handle and, beneath it, an ordinary key cylinder. Nell pulled Thomas's brass key from her pocket. B.C. Office. She inserted it anyway. It would not turn. She tried again. Nothing. "Of course," she whispered. Daniel heard her. "Mom, every time I think he left me an answer, there's another locked door. Maybe he didn't expect you to be the one opening them." That hurt more than Daniel intended. Nell looked at him, and he immediately lowered his eyes. Caleb interrupted gently. "Let's not force it. We know Margaret used this room. Maybe her notebooks tell us something." They returned upstairs. Ruth arrived after Nell called and listened while they described the lock. She frowned over Margaret's notebooks. She hated ordinary locks after a flood ruined records at another storage place. Ruth said, "I remember her saying dates were easier to remember than keys." They searched Margaret's entries for repeated dates. One appeared prominently near the beginning of several notebooks the opening day of Bellwether Creamery. Caleb entered the numbers into the combination. A heavy click sounded inside the door. Nell stared at him. He pulled the handle. Cool, stale air escaped from the room beyond. Shelves filled the narrow chamber from wall to wall. Unlike the boxes in the hidden storeroom, these were wrapped or raised from the floor behind moisture barriers. New metal shelving stood among older wooden units. Nell recognized the hardware store purchases immediately. Thomas had been protecting this room only months before he died. Every box carried a family name or catalog code. Price, Bellwether, Alvarez, dozens more. Nell found Mercer almost at once, but Ruth had stopped in front of a box bearing her own surname. Nell looked at the Mercer label, then stepped away from it. "Yours first," she said. Ruth hesitated before opening the Alvarez box. Inside were old milk checks, photographs, farm records, and bundles of letters tied with cotton tape. Ruth lifted one photograph of a couple standing beside a dairy barn. "My parents," she whispered. Beneath it lay several handwritten pages. Ruth recognized her mother's handwriting before she read the first line. She began aloud, describing the year the family bought its first 12 cows and the winter they nearly lost the barn roof under snow. Her voice lasted 3 sentences before breaking. She pressed the page carefully against the table instead of wiping her eyes with the hand holding it. "I haven't heard her words in 30 years. Nell stood beside her without speaking. Suddenly, Thomas's years of payments felt different. These were not anonymous papers in an obsolete building. Ruth's mother had become present for a moment because someone had decided her ordinary life was worth keeping. Caleb opened the price box only far enough to confirm photographs and records bearing his grandparents' names. His face carried the same stunned recognition Nell had seen when he found his grandmother's photograph upstairs. "This is what your husband was saving?" Ruth said. Nell looked around at the shelves. The Dairy family's archive had survived because Margaret had gathered it and Thomas had refused to let it disappear. Only then did Nell return to the Mercer shelf. The box was lighter than she expected. She placed it on the table and opened the lid. Empty. No testimony. No photographs, no letters. Only a single catalog card lay at the bottom. Nell picked it up. Margaret's original label had been crossed through once. Beneath it was a later note in handwriting she recognized instantly. W. Mercer, material removed by T.M. Daniel read over her shoulder. Dad took it. Nell stared at Thomas's initials after everything they had found. The one family record she needed most was no longer in the archive. Thomas himself had removed it. Nell began with Thomas's calendar. Though at first it seemed useless, most entries were ordinary dentist, oil change, Daniel visiting, furnace service. But several dates from the last 6 months of his life carried only initials and mileage figures. She laid the calendar beside fuel receipts and the Creamery maintenance records. A pattern slowly emerged. On the same days Thomas bought gas outside Haven Ridge, he had marked short sets of initials, P-A-H-R, and returned home later than Nell remembered. He was making trips. Daniel said. They sat at the kitchen table where Thomas had once balanced repair invoices. To the Creamery, Nell shook her head. Not always. Some of these stations are in the opposite direction. They compared the initials with Margaret Bellwether's family index. Price matched P. Alvarez matched A. 2 others corresponded to families whose boxes remained in the vault. Daniel leaned back. He was visiting them. The thought changed something in Nell. Thomas had not simply been maintaining a building in his final months. He had been moving through the lives connected to it. The next day, Daniel drove with her to the former Price farm. Caleb's mother still lived in a smaller house near the property. Though the dairy barn had been converted to storage years earlier, when Nell explained why they had come, the woman nodded almost immediately. Thomas was here in spring. Daniel looked at her. My dad, twice. She remembered him sitting at her kitchen table with a small recorder and a yellow legal pad. He had asked about her parents, how many cows they kept, why they sold the herd, and whether she had photographs she would allow to be copied. He asked if my father's story could someday be used for school children. She said, he was careful about permission, said he didn't want to take anything that didn't belong to him. Daniel stared toward the old barn. He never told us. Maybe he was planning to when he was finished. Nell said, though she no longer knew whether she was defending Thomas or trying to comfort herself. On the drive back, Daniel was quiet for several miles. Then he said, I thought Dad just didn't like talking about the past. Nell watched the road. Maybe he didn't. Maybe that's why he cared so much about everyone else talking. They followed 2 more addresses from Thomas's notes, confirming the same pattern. He had asked descendants for updated family histories, photographs, and permission to preserve materials already held in the Creamery. Some remembered him as awkward but persistent. None described secrecy for its own sake. He seemed to have been preparing something that evening. Nell and Daniel searched Thomas's workshop again. They had already looked there after his death for insurance papers and tools Daniel wanted to keep. This time Nell paid attention to what had been deliberately hidden, rather than simply stored. Behind a row of machinery manuals, she noticed a metal file case wedged flat against the wall. It was dusty on the top edge, but clean around the handle. Daniel? He pulled it free and set it on Thomas's workbench. Inside were folders labeled with family names matching the archive. Most contained photocopies, consent notes, and brief summaries in Thomas's handwriting. Nell turned pages faster until she found Mercer. The folder held copies of old records, but none of the original documents described in Margaret's catalog. Beneath the family folders lay a typed letter. Haven Ridge Historical Society appeared at the top. Nell read it slowly. Thomas proposed donating the Dairy family's archive so it could be cataloged, preserved, and made available to descendants and researchers. He described Bellwether Creamery as a temporary home, not a permanent solution. The letter ended mid-paragraph. It had never been signed or sent. Daniel lowered himself onto the stool beside the bench. He was going to give it away. Not give it away, Nell said. Make sure it survived. Daniel looked toward his father's tools. So all those years, he wasn't keeping it for himself. Nell felt the old anger shift again. Not disappearing, but losing some of its certainty. Thomas had been doing something larger than she imagined, yet he had still shut her out of it. Daniel picked up the unfinished letter. Why wouldn't he just tell us? I don't know. She touched the edge of the Mercer folder. Maybe we'll never know every reason. At the bottom of the case, under several photocopied ledgers, Nell found a single handwritten sheet clipped to a list of missing originals. Thomas's writing was shaky compared with the older notes, but unmistakable. Mercer originals stay with Evelyn until she is ready. Nell read the sentence twice. Who's Evelyn? Daniel asked. Nell searched her memory through 43 years of Thomas's stories and found nothing. The next morning, she carried the note to Ruth Alvarez. Ruth had barely put on her glasses before her expression changed. Evelyn Shaw, she said. Has to be. You know her? Everyone my age knew of her. She lived near Walter Mercer's farm. Ruth looked at Nell over the paper. If she still has those records, there's a reason Thomas left them with her. Nell folded the note carefully. Where does she live? Ruth gave her the address, then paused. Nell, Evelyn is 91. Nell understood what Ruth was really saying. Time had already taken Thomas. It might take the last person holding his father's story, too. She slipped the note into her purse. For the first time since opening the Creamery door, the missing Mercer records had a destination. Evelyn Shaw had them. Evelyn Shaw lived in a small ranch house at the edge of Haven Ridge, surrounded by wind-bent maples and a yard that had once bordered open farmland. Daniel drove, and Nell carried Thomas's note in her purse. When Evelyn opened the door, she looked smaller than Nell expected, but her eyes were sharp. At the mention of Walter Mercer, she studied Nell for several seconds before letting them in. Thomas came here, she said before Nell could explain much. More than once, Daniel leaned forward. When, over the last few years, he asked questions. Sometimes he sat right where you're sitting. Evelyn pointed to a chair beside the window. He wanted the papers, then decided he didn't. Nell took out Thomas's handwritten instruction. He wrote that the Mercer originals should stay with you until we were ready. Evelyn read it and nodded. That sounds like him. She disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a flat archival box. She placed it on the coffee table but kept one hand resting on the lid. Your husband spent most of his life angry at his father. Nell had known Thomas rarely spoke of Walter, but anger was something he had concealed behind clipped answers and changed subjects. He believed Walter lost the farm because he borrowed too much. Evelyn continued, then left the family when things went bad. Daniel looked at Nell. That was close to the little Thomas had ever told them. Evelyn's mouth tightened. That was not the whole story. She described the early 1980s. When interest rates rose, milk prices weakened, and small dairy farms across the region were squeezed by debt. Walter Mercer's farm was already struggling. So were several others nearby. People remember foreclosures, Evelyn said. They forget what came before them. Meetings at kitchen tables, men signing papers they barely understood, families trying to buy one more season. Walter had been involved in one of those arrangements. Thomas, still young and furious, saw only the result. The Mercer herd was sold, the land was lost, and Walter eventually left Haven Ridge for agricultural work elsewhere. Thomas decided his father had failed them. Evelyn said, Walter never found the courage to explain himself properly. Nell felt a familiar ache. Thomas had spent 43 years being careful with money, repairing things long past the point most people would replace them, treating debt as something almost shameful. She had always thought that was simply his nature. When did Thomas learn there was more to it, she asked. After Margaret's record surfaced? Evelyn lifted the box lid. Inside were loan documents, correspondence, copies of farm valuations, and several handwritten letters. He came here after he found her notes. He wanted proof. Then when he saw it, he got angry all over again, only this time at himself. Daniel swallowed. Why didn't he take these? Evelyn looked at him. Because knowing something and accepting it are not the same thing. Nell reached for the first group of documents. Several neighboring farm names appeared beside Walter's. Price was one. Bellwether was another. There were references to collateral, restructuring, guarantees, and shared obligations. The language was dense and legalistic. I don't understand this, Nell admitted. Evelyn pointed to one section. Walter put more of his own property on the line than Thomas ever knew. To cover someone else's debt, Daniel asked. Partly. Why, that's what Margaret wanted him to explain. Nell read farther. The paperwork showed Walter's herd and acreage tied to a restructuring agreement involving multiple nearby farms. But the documents did not say whether Walter had made a reckless decision, caused the losses, or knowingly absorbed risk to help the others. Some figures contradicted others. Dates overlapped in ways Nell could not follow. Daniel took one page and frowned. It could look like he dragged them into it. Evelyn shook her head. Or the other way around. Papers don't always tell you who was trying to save whom. She removed a sealed envelope from beneath the files. Margaret Bellwether's handwriting crossed the front in faded ink. Walter Mercer testimony. Nell did not take it immediately. For years, Thomas had apparently carried the belief that his father abandoned him after ruining the family farm. Then he discovered enough evidence to doubt that story, but not enough courage to bring the originals home. Daniel stared at the envelope. Did Dad read this? Yes, Evelyn said. Right here. What did he say? Evelyn looked toward the chair by the window. Nothing for a long time. Then he asked me to keep it. Now imagined Thomas sitting there, older than Walter had ever become in his memory, reading words that forced him to reconsider an entire childhood. She felt grief for him in a new way, not only because he was gone, but because he had lived long enough to discover that the story he built his anger around might have been wrong. Daniel's voice was quiet. I'm starting to think I'm more like him than I wanted to admit. Nell turned to him. How holding things in, deciding what people mean before I ask them? Neither of them spoke for a moment. Evelyn slid the envelope across the table. Thomas left this because he wasn't ready. That doesn't mean you have to leave it too. Nell rested her fingertips on Margaret's label. The question that had followed them from the creamery was finally narrowed to one man's account. Had Walter Mercer destroyed his family's future through bad decisions? Or had he given up his own farm trying to keep others from losing theirs? Nell broke the seal and unfolded Walter Mercer's testimony. Nell opened Thomas's envelope at the kitchen table, in the chair across from the one he had occupied for 43 years. His letter was shorter than she expected. He began by apologizing, not for Bellwether itself, but for allowing each year of silence to make the next one easier. Thomas wrote that when Margaret's archive finally showed him what Walter had done during the farm crisis, relief came first. His father had not been the careless failure Thomas had imagined. Then came shame. Thomas had spent decades judging Walter by the worst years of his life, and Walter had died before his son understood the sacrifice behind them. Thomas could not return the Mercer farm or repair what had passed between father and son. But when Margaret Bellwether's heirs prepared to dispose of the old creamery and what remained inside it, he could not watch more families disappear into silence. So he kept the building. He protected Margaret's collection, found descendants, copied photographs, recorded histories, and slowly prepared the archive for a future beyond him. Then came the line that made Nell cover her mouth with one hand. "I meant to tell you, Nell. After the first year, I had to explain 1 year of secrecy. After 5, I had to explain 5. I kept waiting until I could explain it properly. I waited too long." At the bottom, Thomas had written one request. "Don't preserve the building for me. Preserve the stories only if they still matter to the people they belong to." Nell read that sentence to Daniel the next morning. He sat silently for a moment, then said, "So we asked them." That became their answer. Nell contacted the Haven Ridge Historical Society, the county library, descendants listed in Thomas's files, and an agricultural history program with experience preserving rural records. She expected polite interest. Instead, families began calling. Some came to Bellwether carrying photographs in envelopes and milk statements saved in dresser drawers. Others identified faces Margaret had labeled only with first names. Caleb brought additional Price family records. Ruth sat for an oral history about her parents and insisted that the story include her mother's habit of naming every cow. Daniel began helping organize Thomas's catalog for digitization. One afternoon, Nell found him reading Walter's complete testimony beside a scanner. "Grandpa lost everything," he said, "and Dad spent half his life thinking it meant he didn't care." Thomas learned the truth eventually. Too late to tell him. Nell touched Daniel's shoulder, but not too late to do something with it. Preserving everything inside Bellwether proved impossible. Engineers confirmed what Caleb had warned from the beginning. Restoring the entire industrial building would cost more than Nell could responsibly spend. For the first time, she did not interpret that as failure. Thomas had told her not to build a monument to him. Martin Voss returned after hearing that Nell intended to preserve the archive. His need for access had not changed, and neither had the economic reality of the property. This time they discussed boundaries instead of an all-or-nothing sale. Voss purchased part of the adjoining land and secured the access rights his grain storage expansion required. The payment gave Nell enough room to stabilize the creamery's historic front office and vault without risking her savings. Climate-sensitive originals would be transferred to professional archival storage, while copies and rotating displays could remain in Haven Ridge. Months later, the front office looked different without pretending to be new. The brick had been repaired where necessary. The floor was safe. One restored shelf held reproductions of old milk ledgers, family photographs, and Margaret Bellwether's catalog pages. The vault below no longer carried the burden of being the collection's only protection. On opening day, Nell watched descendants move slowly through the room. Caleb stood before the photograph of his grandmother beside the Holstein. Ruth corrected someone who had identified an old barn incorrectly, then laughed when they thanked her. Daniel showed 2 children how the farm numbers in the ledger connected to family names. The plaque near the entrance did not call Thomas the founder of anything. Margaret had created the Dairy Family's archive. Thomas had become its caretaker when it might otherwise have disappeared. The plaque honored the dairy families of Haven Ridge and the people who preserved their records. Beneath the first display, Nell placed Thomas's handwritten sentence in a simple frame. They were never just numbers. Nearby hung an enlarged photograph discovered among the Mercer materials. Walter stood beside several neighboring farmers, his sleeves rolled above his elbows, one hand resting on a fence post. Nell studied his face. Once, seeing him would have reminded her only of everything Thomas had refused to explain. Now she understood that Thomas's silence had begun long before their marriage, in a boy's anger toward a father he believed had abandoned him. That did not erase the secrecy. It simply made it human. Before the opening ended, Nell added one final folder to the catalog: Thomas Mercer. She included his unfinished proposal to the Historical Society, copies of his maintenance records, his notes from visits with dairy families, and an account of how he had protected Margaret's collection. She did not describe him as the man who saved Haven Ridge. He would have hated that. She wrote instead, caretaker of the dairy family's archive. Then she signed her own name beneath the record as the person who transferred his work back to the community. Daniel stood beside her. Dad would probably complain about having his own file. Nell smiled. He isn't here to argue. The words still hurt, but they no longer emptied the room. That evening, after everyone had gone, Nell turned off the office lights and stepped outside. Sunset stretched across the fields beyond the creamery, catching the old brick in a soft red glow. She locked the preserved office door with Thomas's brass key. For months, every locked door had seemed to conceal something from her. This one did not. Under her other arm was a box of newly donated family photographs waiting to be cataloged. Nell walked toward her car, carrying no secret, only stories that had finally been returned to the people who owned them. Walter Mercer's testimony began without apology. He wrote that by the early 1980s, nearly every dairy farmer he knew was borrowing against something: land, equipment, cattle, or next year's milk check. Interest costs were climbing while milk income failed to keep pace. One bad season could become a debt that followed a family into the next. Nell read slowly at Evelyn's table, while Daniel followed the loan documents beside her. Walter described meetings among neighboring farmers who were trying to avoid immediate foreclosure. Several farms were already too exposed to qualify for workable terms alone. The Mercer farm was struggling too, but Walter still had acreage and a herd that lenders would accept as collateral. A restructuring arrangement was proposed. By placing more of his own assets behind it, Walter could buy several families' time. He knew exactly what that meant. "I was not saving farms," Walter had written. "I was buying them another season to try to save themselves." The Price name appeared in the supporting documents. So did Bellwether and others Nell recognized from Margaret's archive. Walter understood that if conditions failed to improve, his own farm would absorb losses it could not survive. He signed anyway. The next pages confirmed the result. His herd was sold. Then the land went. Some neighboring families survived longer. A few recovered enough to remain in farming for years. Walter did not. Daniel stared at a loan statement. So Grandpa knew he could lose everything. Evelyn nodded. He knew. Why didn't he tell Dad? Evelyn looked toward the window. Pride can make a man silent when speaking would save him more than silence ever could. Walter's testimony answered that too. He had been ashamed to return home after the sale and explain to his son that he had risked the family farm on people Thomas barely knew. He left Haven Ridge for seasonal agricultural work, telling himself he would explain once he had rebuilt something worth returning with. He never did. Thomas had grown up with the simpler story his father borrowed recklessly. Lost the farm and abandoned the family afterward. Nell folded her hands around the pages. Thomas had carried that judgment for decades. By the time Margaret's record showed him what Walter had actually done, Walter was already dead. There could be no confrontation, apology, or reconciliation. Only documents and the terrible knowledge that understanding had arrived too late. Daniel's eyes remained on his grandfather's signature. Dad must have hated himself, maybe for a while, Nell said. She thought of the moisture barriers, repaired roof, family visits, and unfinished proposal to preserve the archive. Then I think he decided to do something with it, back at Bellwether. Nell returned Walter's testimony to the Mercer materials. Caleb was nearby checking the braced floor, and Ruth had come to help identify several photographs. When Nell explained what Walter had done, Caleb sat down. His grandparents' farm had been among those given time by the arrangement. My grandfather always said they nearly lost the place in the 80s, he said. He never told me someone else put land behind their chance to keep it. Ruth looked around the vault. That's why Margaret kept these things? Families remember the ending. Records remember what happened before it. Nell understood then why Thomas could not sell Bellwether after discovering the truth. The building had held the evidence that changed his father from a failure in his memory into a flawed man who had sacrificed more than his son ever knew. But understanding Thomas did not repair the roof or pay insurance. That afternoon, Martin Voss called. His offer deadline had arrived. He needed an answer because his expansion plans could not remain unsettled. Nell stood in the Creamery office holding the phone. Weeks earlier, his offer had seemed like an escape. Now accepting it immediately, before arranging protection for the archive, felt like reducing everything she had found to the same thing Thomas's note rejected. Numbers without people attached. I'm not accepting the current offer, she told Voss. There was a pause. I understand, he said. If circumstances change, call me. Nell appreciated that he did not argue. Afterward, Daniel asked, What happens now? She looked at the stained ceiling. I don't know yet. You can't spend everything saving this place. I know, and she did. Preserving history would mean little if she destroyed her own security doing it. The truth had solved the mystery of Walter, but it had not solved the practical problem Thomas had left behind. That evening, Nell brought Thomas's portable file case home and searched it again, hoping for some note about what he intended to do next. Beneath the photocopies, her fingers caught on an envelope lying flat against the bottom. She had missed it before because its cream-colored paper nearly matched the lining. Her name was written across the front in Thomas's hand. Not Nell Mercer, not an instruction for the archive, simply Nell. She sat down at the kitchen table, suddenly unable to open it. After weeks of following Thomas through ledgers, receipts, buildings, and other people's memories, this was the first thing that seemed left only for her. Nell turned the envelope over. On the sealed flap, Thomas had written 2 more words. For Nell.